Thank you all for being here this afternoon. On this last day of the Borlaug Dialogues as part of the World Food Prize events. And so we are delighted that you're able to participate in this conversation with us this afternoon. And why are we delighted? We're delighted because we as a global community, and all of you in this room, many of you who I know, we have worked since 2015 to support the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly the goal around addressing the end of hunger, addressing access to nutritious food. But this same community of actors has also worked to meet the climate accord that we made in Paris. Right now, we're like 2 months away from the end of 2025, and we're off track on both. And the sense of urgency that is required for us to get on track, to get anywhere close to what is required for the Sustainable Development Goals or for the Paris Accord, that sense of urgency is not present. It's not present in our conversations, and I fear that there's been little sense of urgency in the conversations that we've had over this last 3 days. But I am delighted that with the partnership that FSF has developed with the Environmental Defense Fund, that there's a recognition that we must do more. We must bring together our partners. We must bring together corporates. We must bring together governments to support what is necessary to address, particularly for this conversation today, the methane issue. We know that methane is more detrimental to our atmosphere than carbon. We know that some 60% of the total global methane emissions come from the food system, and that 50% of that is from livestock. And so if we are going to talk about urgency and moving forward and taking the action that is required from a public sector, private sector, as well as all of us who continue to nudge public and private sector, we must talk about livestock. But we also must, and I think what is evolved in this conversation amongst this community is a recognition that context is important when you talk about methane reduction. Because the production of methane in the global north from livestock is quite different than in the global south. And the consumption of animal protein is quite different in the global north. And the necessity for animal protein as a part of the diverse diet that is required is quite different by context. So all of those factors must be part of our consideration when we sit in rooms like these and talk about solutions for the entire global community. So I'm delighted that there's a recognition. We started this journey some year and a half ago, Megan, with recognizing that it wasn't good enough to just go to the livestock community to suggest that we should reduce animal protein consumption. It wasn't enough to just talk about sustainable livestock management, because for many, the question becomes, where do alternative proteins fit into this? And the one conversation that I think we've made significant progress on is a recognition that the better name is complementary proteins as opposed to alternative proteins, because we need a package of solutions when we begin to talk about where's the answer. And so as we've gone on this journey, it was important that as opposed to trying to drive for commitment, that the first thing we needed to do was develop trust amongst all of these diverse actors. And that trust has come through a series of conversations, presentations. I recently presented to the Meat Institute, where the ideas that we put forward about what was necessary were actually well received. And the last piece of this puzzle are consumers. Because there's a big piece of business out there, and the question that we continuously receive, whether you're talking about alternative protein businesses or animal protein businesses, that the question is, but there is no consumer demand for sustainably produced, for alternatives, at the level that is necessary to support the shifts that are required. So I'm delighted that we have a panel here today of experts and friends who we can talk together about the work that each of our panelists is doing today around all these issues that I've just put out in front of you, in hopes of beginning to really identify the what is it that we are doing, must do, in order to achieve the goals that we know we must achieve. And we're on a track. COP29 is coming up at Baku. More conversation there about the what is possible. But imagine if between now and then, with this group of actors, with these leaders, with governments, with private sector companies, both from the livestock, the animal protein community, as well as the complementary protein community, we were able to begin to develop a pathway forward to actually reduce methane to the point where it made a difference. So that is the conversation I'm hoping that we can have today, and I will. First of all, let me thank our panelists for joining us, and appreciate the fact that we are working on the schedule of the Borlaug dialogues, and though we thought we were going to start some 30 minutes ago, we are beginning now. But I would ask Megan, I see we still have 35 minutes left for this dialogue to remain on time. And so what I'd love to do is just jump right into the conversation with each of you by asking each one of you to begin by introducing yourself and 1-2 sentences why this issue is critical to the work that you are performing. Starting. Oh, you have your own microphone? Go ahead.
Mine. Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Carlos Saviani from Cargill. I'm a beef sustainability director there. I work on the packing, slaughter, beef processing business side. Although I'm part of the corporate sustainability team, but I work very closely with the beef team to address the environmental impacts and also social impacts of beef production. And our main focus has been in North America, Canada, and US, although we import beef from Australia, New Zealand, South America as well. And to your point, the biggest challenge that we face, and that's why we are working beef sustainability, is that most of the environmental impacts are not within our processing and our own facilities, but is within the supply chain. And I have an experience, as a cattle rancher, but also working for the beef and dairy industries for 20 years. And that's what we have been focusing on in working with our supply chain, with our direct suppliers, our indirect suppliers, to address the biggest impacts to beef production that are feeding into us, right?
Yeah.
the scope 3, the footprints that are generated at our suppliers, ended up feeding into us, and that get transferred to our customers. And both us and our customers have targets, and we're working hard to reduce those footprints.
Carlos, it's great to hear the work that Cargill's doing in the space, but that was more than 2 sentences. But we won't hold it against you. Let me go, Shirley, to you next and ask you to introduce yourself and tell us in 2 sentences, with your work, why is this issue important and how I'll stop there.
Okay. Thank you. And good afternoon now, everyone. My name's Shirley Tarawale. I'm Assistant Director General at ILRI. ILRI is the International Livestock Research Institute. I'm based in Kenya. I'm also chair of the Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock, which is a global multi-stakeholder partnership. As a CG Research Center, ILRI conducts livestock research for development. For us, this issue of a better balanced conversation around livestock, methane, feeding people is absolutely crucial, because livestock have multiple roles in the lives of well over 1 billion people. And we need to find solutions for people's healthy nutrition, meeting the future demand, while simultaneously addressing the challenges of climate, methane, and other harms that could come if we get that transition wrong. And we need to recognize that livestock systems are hugely diverse. So the pathways we take are going to look different. And this conversation helps us to explore that.
Terrific. Thank you, Shirley. You 2 went over 2 sentences, but it's difficult to answer the question. I appreciate that. Paul Newman, over to you, and briefly introduce yourself and your organization and why and how your work in this area of methane reduction is so important.
Just take a deep breath to get this sentence out. No. My name is Paul Newnham. I'm the CEO at the SDG2 Advocacy Hub, and also the Chief Beans Officer for Beans is How, which is a campaign to double bean, pea, and lentil consumption globally. Why this conversation matters to me. Obviously, we have a significant challenge. We are behind on so many of our indicators around the SDGs. Food systems are contributing and also a potential solution to some of our biggest climate and planetary issues, as well as our human health issues. And so I'm interested in any conversation which is talking about how do we spark more urgent change. Full stop.
Wow. Okay. How do we spark more urgent change? I'm on your team on that one. Britt, over to you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Britt Grossman. I lead the Agriculture, Water and Food work at the Environment and Defense Fund. And we are the organization that has this little thing, a satellite that looks at methane. So we really care about methane, 80 times more powerful in the first 20 years than CO2. We also care about farmers, and we also care about livelihoods, and we care about hunger and food and nutrition. So what we're really trying to figure out is how can we get the triple win that's in the title of this talk. So how can we reduce methane across the food sector, but also do it in a way that it protects the livelihoods of people and their protein requirements? And so as an advocacy organization, we really work on figuring out how to break barriers to get that transition. How can we make it affordable for farmers? How can we make sure it doesn't increase food prices? All those kind of things. Sorry if that was more than 2 sentences. And urgency, absolutely.
And urgency. And I'm going to stay with you, Britt, for a moment, because the partnership with the Food Systems for the Future and EDF was what created or led to or supported the listening sessions that occurred over the last year. So what were some of the learnings from our listening program regarding common ground for collaboration and action across the the ruminant meat community as well as the complementary protein area. In your opinion, what were some of the most important learnings from those listening sessions?
Yes, thank you. So the learning sessions were really set up to bridge the gap of the really polarized discussion that is currently happening between what people like to call alternative protein, what we call complementary protein, and the livestock sector. This is very black and white. We think there really has to be an and solution. So we started these listening sessions speaking to people in both sectors and asking them about what they saw as opportunities and barriers. And we heard a lot of common barriers coming through: consumer acceptability, consumer demand or lack of consumer demand, affordability, measuring metrics, MMRV. So, and we didn't really hear that polarization in our discussion, which was interesting. So I think it's more put forward by some NGOs and some consumer groups than it really is by the industry sectors themselves. But yeah, some of those barriers were very common for both of them.
And as we think about those barriers that were very common, let me come back to you, Carlos. Because from the meat processing perspective, what are the most promising and scalable opportunities to mitigate methane emissions? And how do you go from piloting, which I understand Cargill is doing in a number of different areas, to actually scaling across the entire business?
Yeah, I think the first one is productivity and efficiency, right? Making sure we are producing more with less as much as possible. And that's where genetics, technologies, new solutions, new interventions, come into play. And then collaborating with the producers, right? I mean, we have to make sure that producers not only are comfortable in applying those interventions, technologies, genetics, new solutions, but they can fit that with their economics, right, and with their production systems. And that's where the biggest challenges are. We have 11 different initiatives with different NGOs and different customers, partners, in implementing interventions and projects with ranchers and feedlots as well. And it's not easy. It's really hard. And it's not only driven by economics. Economic plays a major role, but also producers face labor challenges, right? Many beef producers, they are not focused only on beef. They have other activities. And even though they understand certain things can help them make more money, but they just don't have the time. Or they don't want to go through the hassle of implementing things. And so the challenges are a little bit deeper than people may think. But it's really important that we tackle those. And the only way to do that is through collaboration. And that's where working with customers, with suppliers, with NGOs, with governments, in order to take things to scale. Because they're not easy. They require, a lot of people. They require, a lot of efforts. But it can be done. The pilots are the proofs that we need to demonstrate that it can be done at scale.
What you didn't talk about that we've heard in the listening sessions, and I heard when I was at the Meat Institute, is the lack of market for sustainably produced livestock or sustainably managed livestock. That there's additional costs, but there's no market to support that additional cost.
Yeah,
How would you speak to that?
Yeah, there's not a perfect market. There's not someone there flagging, hey, come here with a sustainable beef, 30% lower carbon footprint, I'm going to pay you, 15% more. But remember, how we used to consume chicken, right? Remember that? I mean, when I was a kid, the roasted chicken was the only way to consume chicken, the whole chicken, and it was only once a month or once a week, right? Normally on Sundays. And then look at today, right? I mean, chicken it's the daily protein, right? Everybody eats chicken almost on a daily basis. But at that time, no one was asking the processors, hey, please, could you take this whole chicken and slice in different pieces? I just want the breast, or I just want the drums, or could you do that and reduce the price, by X%? No one was saying that, right? It's like that Henry Ford quote about faster horses, right? People never ask about cars. They were asking for faster horses. So people maybe don't know what they need or they want, right? But you have to offer, you have to put in front of them. So I think it takes a lot of ingenuity, creativity from the companies like Cargill, but also from others, from retailers, food processors, to come up, to understand, what is underneath people's minds, especially the new generation. I mean, you look at Gen Zs, they are really interested in sustainability. Maybe it's just a matter of putting in front of them new products, new solutions that are going to be attractive to them, right? They don't even know what they want.
They don't, new products, new solutions. That brings me right to you, Shirley, because we hear a lot about red seaweed that reduces burping, or solutions that are CRISPR-based that will change the DNA to reduce, if not eliminate. You are responsible for the science and the research, and you're one of those. I won't put it all on you. But where are we in the advances that are necessary to mitigate livestock methane emissions in reality, and not just from the, here's a blurb that sounds really good?
Yeah, we do research with the end in mind. And one of those ends, of course, is this, as Carlos said, production efficiency. But we're focused across Africa and Asia. So our research needs to deliver technical solutions for animal health, animal genetics, and better nutrition that can be packaged and work for the small-scale farmers who currently are producing some 70% of the milk and meat across those lower-income economies. That means more nutritious food for people who desperately need it, but it also means that addressing that production efficiency through that mixture, that bundling, if you like, of technologies can reduce climate emissions by about 30%. And when we talk about livestock in these low-income systems, you can also have this sort of double win where everything you do to mitigate also has adaptation benefits. And we know that those situations are where climate change is really impacting on productivity in a very serious way in many cases. In terms of the sort of latest science, we really, as our organization in Kenya and across other countries, provide a bridge between connecting some of that latest science, whether it's genomics or it's seaweed or it's whatever. It's not just going to work if we import it whole scale into those systems. So we've got to provide a bridge, a connector that's farmer facing, and that will work. Maybe that's enough on that for now.
No, yeah, I think that's quite critical, because it's the science is good, but the implementation of science and the marketing of science is what is critical to ensuring that we go from idea to actually the opportunity for scale. And the work that you just described, I think, is quite important to achieving that. Britt, I'm looking at you, and you're sitting here. I was going to go to Paul next, but if you want to build on that point.
No, I was just going to add in that the productivity piece is so important. People think about seaweed or other potential solutions to reduce the burps, the emissions, but actually in a large part of the world, so much can be done with readily available solutions, improving the healthcare of the animal, improving the feed of the animal. And those are all solutions that also increase the productivity and therefore improve livelihoods. And, that's where you get that triple win. And those are, especially for the Global South, what we should be focusing on, not the silver bullets, not the new medication. Not yet.
I think we still need to have opportunities to connect with those and to adapt and translate them. Because, as Paul said, there's an urgency here. So we can't just stay as we are. We've got to keep an eye on what's happening and think about how could we use the latest genomics or whatever it might be.
Paul, you were just called out there. Let me come to you. We spent much of this discussion talking about animal protein. Let's talk about diversification of protein and how that could potentially make a difference in the reduction of methane. And is there a real opportunity for diversification as opposed to the idea of alternative, one or the other?
Yeah, look, I think at the moment these conversations, they start at both ends, and the answer's in the middle. The answer's not an either or, because that just pits two sides against each other to fight it out. And I can tell you who's going to win, because one side's got a lot of resources and a lot to lose, and that's connected to economies and governments and everything else. And also, they're there. So, but we need to shift. So how do we come up with a solution that's shift? I think part of it is this conversation always dominates around protein. Why are we talking so much about protein? Is there a protein problem in North America? Is there a protein problem in most of Europe? Any dietitian I talk to or nutritionist says no. In some parts of sub-Saharan Africa, there is. In some parts of Asia, there is. And we should be looking at increasing protein access. But we should be talking about diets. And if we talk about diversified diets, there is a huge range of solutions. We're celebrating 2 laureates who are talking about a huge range of solutions. We're talking about a biodiversity that is available. We're talking about a number of different solutions that are there that include proteins, but they also include fiber, they also include micro and macronutrients. So if we shift the conversation towards diets, I think there's a huge opportunity. I also think then we can change the conversation from an either or. I get this with people and they say, so are you a meat eater or a vegan? And I'm like, these are almost, the imagery is just all wrong. I don't want to be either. So how do I be something in the middle? How do we think about serving size? How do we think about the way our dishes are created? So we're going, can we get plant-based? And when advocates are, let's get plant-based on the menu. But they want vegan, really is what they're often saying, rather than going a dish that has animal proteins built into it, but they're highly valued. They're there as a garnish. They're there as a flavour or an addition. So I think we've got to get way more creative in the way that we're approaching this. We're talking about beans, peas and lentils. Why? Because most people in the world that you talk to will say they're a triple win already. They're really good for people. They're really good for the planet. They're good for soils. They're good for nitrogen fixing and all these low water, many varieties. They're also amazingly affordable. And in a environment in which we have huge price pressure, no matter where you live in the world, and for some of us that means limited choices around treats and extra things, and others it's life and death, feeding one meal, and cutting that for somebody in the family. So I think we need to have a much more nuanced conversation around diet. I think we need to be thinking about the centre. I think that includes looking at deals to be made. I was having a conversation around blending. Imagine if we could change what blended beef is in people's minds to it included 40% beans or peas or lentils in some way. That could reduce the output, increase the amount available globally so that we can meet a growing population without more intensification, without more scale. And we can then start to shift people's diets and their tastes and their flavours. We can also think about where are the parts of the world where this is built into diets? Because often there's no money going into maintaining those diets, but there is money going into marketing to shift those diets. And so we're shifting big populations away from healthy, sustainable diets towards diets which are more complex, that have bigger impacts on health and environment. And we're not thinking about that in the way that I think we could be.
So help us think about that in the way that we should be. As the lead on the advocacy hub for the for the SDGs, what are we missing that would, if we paid more attention, if we shifted our narrative in a particular way, we could bring consumers and more of that millennial population in particular, what we just talked about, into the support for the changes that you've just described and the other panelists have also alluded to?
So I think we have to really look into the best in class in behavioural change. We need to be looking at insights around how do you shift markets. I don't think we need to wait for the market demand to occur for business to invest. Business is looking for opportunities. They know there's going to be shifts that are going to happen. But what we need to be thinking about is how are we communicating these stories? You know, friends of mine at the Food for Climate League have done a lot of research around what drives climate-friendly choices. And they say, don't talk about climate. Yeah. Like, you talk about climate, no one's buying that. People are choosing on taste, flavour, convenience. They want foods that are tasty, convenient, and flavourful. When we've been talking about beans, they did some interesting studies around leaning into heritage, leaning into this food is part of my identity. This food is part of my history of where I'm from, my story of my culture. Now, functionality also works for other audiences that are maybe disconnected from that heritage. So we have to get smarter about how we're doing this. We have to be thinking about where are those messages that are confusing, which also confuse people about this is bad and this is good, when it's actually a much more nuanced conversation. There isn't, animal protein is not bad. It's actually very good for people. It also, though, needs fibre and other micronutrients to be part of the plate. So how are we building plates and dishes that are more complementary? How are we thinking about that in different ways? How are we looking at culture and learning from that and celebrating that where this is done well as well? Mm-hmm. And not sort of saying that's not quite as sophisticated or it's not quite as elevated. And so then we have to think about that. And so we do a lot of work with chefs in thinking about how do you do that? How do you think differently? I was mentioning on the side of stage Gaston Acurio, who is the father of Peruvian cuisine, and he was talking about how do you use animal proteins as a garnish in a dish and just think completely differently, rather than kind of them being the feature of the dish that you build around. But this has been built into the way we train chefs, the way we build menus, the way we think about food. And so we have to think differently, and that means diversifying that thinking.
You've sparked interest amongst your fellow panelists here, and Shirley wants to come in very quickly first, and then Carlos, and then I want to come to the audience to get your thoughts on this conversation.
Yeah, I think part of what Paul is talking about is making a much better connection between nutrition and food systems. If you imagine, when we talk about nutrients, we mostly agree that nutrients are important. There's various nutrients that we all need as human beings. Those nutrients get packed into foods, and mostly we agree. We need protein, we need fat, we need carbohydrates, we need a whole mix of minerals and so on. When the foods get packaged into diets, then there's a bit more disagreement, because there's supply, affordability, there's tradition, there's consumer choice, all those things that Paul was just talking about, even knowledge about nutrition and so on. So we start to diverge. When we get into the food system where those foods come from, that diversity, and we've talked so much this week about diversity, starts to get us kind of confused, because we're in very different production systems with a very different mixture of animal and plant and sometimes fish and so on, ingredients that need to be combined on a plate to give a nutritious diet. So making those connections and saying, where are we in this system? We have really good dairy, we have lots of beans or whatever it might be, we have lots of green leafy vegetables. How can we grow that and transition it to something that's really a good diet?
Yes, we need more diversity on our plates. I think we'll all agree to that. Go ahead, Carlos.
Diversity not only between animal proteins and vegetables, but also within the animal proteins. Yeah. I grew up, eating liver, kidneys, hearts, and talking about heritage foods. I'm Brazilian, so we have a famous dish called feijoada, which is beans with pork, the byproducts from pork. But nowadays, people are replacing those with primary cuts of pork. And a very scary conversation I had the other day, we sell a lot of byproducts to the pet food industry, right? Because humans are not buying that anymore. not by much. And even in the pet food industry, this person who is a big leader of a big pet food company was saying that it was really scary because a lot of competition were driving consumers of pet food to move to pet food that are using what they call real cuts of meat, competing with human food. So steaks and salmon, and that's crazy, right? And people don't know that the wolves in nature, the first thing they eat in the animal is the liver and the heart. Those are the most nutritious parts.
Right.
So how we can also diversify, right, to make sure that we use those parts of the animals.
You know,
that
I
are
smile. I want to
fantastic.
go to our audience and get questions from them. But when I was growing up, my father would never cook or allow my mother even to cook the heart and the liver and the other pieces because that was deemed slave food. Those were the pieces that were left over and the only things. And so he felt as if he had prospered and he was able to buy higher cuts of beef. And so there's some cultural issues here with how we and what we eat. Let's go to the audience for questions. I see a couple hands, and I'm going to ask my colleagues to get you a microphone and ask you to make your questions short so we have an opportunity to answer. And we'll take these two questions. I'll bring it back to the panel.
Hi, I'd like to address Shirley with my generation. I'm a freshman at ISU, creating these grand ideas like 3D printing meat and using CRISPR to change animals and plants to be more nutritious. How do we communicate that with the farmers themselves? And I know that science can be scary for individuals, especially just, their day-to-day lives and farmers being so disconnected from science. How do we bridge that gap between?
We've got it. Okay, how do we communicate the science to farmers as well as to consumers to bridge the gap of understanding? We have one more question we want to take right here. Oh, same question. Okay, back to the panel. Who wants to take it? All right, Britt, we'll start with you.
I'll give it a try. So, first thing I would say is that farmers are actually a lot more invested in science than you might think. A lot of farmers are incredibly smart and themselves have science degrees, grew up with, farming family, went to university, went back to the farm. So first thing I would say is don't underestimate their knowledge and their eagerness to hear. Secondly, farmers, and I'm now talking about sort of American farmers for a minute, have been using new types, new varieties of seeds year on year. And it's really the suppliers who sell the products that sell on things like productivity, eventual price, and consumer acceptance. So I think the last one is one of the problems. Like, I think a farmer might be hesitant to take on a CRISPR technology because they do not know if their product will be accepted by the end consumer. Will it be seen as Frankenstein meat? And so I think, for me, it's less a communication to the farmer that's the big gap than to the eventual consumer. If the farmer will believe the science, is what I've seen so far, they will need to know that their product will be in demand. That's one of the biggest gaps, I would
First
say.
to Carlos, then to you, Paul.
Yeah, when talking about science adoption by farmers, you're always going to see that bell-shaped curve that we see for all the humans, right? You have the early adopters, the followers, and the laggards. So you have to first focus on the progressive ones, get them convinced and get them using the technologies, and then you can work with them to promote that technology to the followers. And you can do field days, you can do speaking engagements, you can do meetings, but it's always better to have a farm-to-farm conversation than have a company or a scientist conversation with a farmer. So you can use those early adopters to then spread the word. And farmers love to see, things that are really working on the field, that are really, generating the results that are expected. And they tend to believe more on their peers, neighbors, other farmers than scientists.
Just a quick, often on this science conversation we get it's really fascinating and it's really important, and we should spend a lot of energy there. But we also shouldn't get stuck on debating these new technologies and everything else when we also have existing technologies which can actually really drive forward mitigation and really have impact, but they're actually not getting to equally across the world. They're getting to certain communities, but they're not being made available to everyone. And so we have a very lumpy and uneven system where some people are still utilizing science from 100 years ago, or lack of, these new initiatives that are well proven. And so this becomes a barrier, I think. And I think we're talking about barriers and opportunities. I think there's an opportunity for that investment to be rolled out, that some of the work that ILRI does and the proven scientific agreed ways of going forward are not held up because there's some conversation about how do we grow a stake in a lab for X billion dollars investment in 15 years' time. 15 years' time is a long way away. We've got a lot to do now. And so I think it's really getting some of those innovations out into the market quickly.
I know, Shirley, go ahead.
What we do is exactly what Paul says. We use the science that's there to deliver the results. But we also got to, as I said, keep an eye on the new science that we can bring into the mix. And as Carlos said, no farmer's going to refuse something that improves their productivity, their income. It mitigates their risk. Many farmers are really just balancing things to mitigate risk. And when we bring those solutions, they'll fly.
So as we close out this conversation, let's go for a call to action. We've talked about opportunities and barriers, partnerships, the need for education, research. If there one ask, one direction, one thing you'd ask this audience to do to help move this work forward, what would it be? Start with you, Carlos.
Learn from history. So let's learn from success that we had in food safety, in milk quality, for instance, and see what we did there that made us move forward and reach, the goals that we had. I think there's a lot of learnings there for us to take.
Terrific. Shirley?
No more binary conversations. It's all of us in the mix because this is urgent and we've got to work together to deliver a whole diversity of solutions.
Paul?
Eat more beans.
Britt?
Be braver in your ambition, both political, countries, and companies. There are a lot of solutions, easily implementable, easily affordable. We can reduce methane by 30% right now if we want to, and it doesn't necessarily rely on the new technology. Ambition and urgency.
Ambition, urgency, and I would say imagination for what is possible. Thank you all for participating with us today.